Good night, good night, good night, good night, everyone. Welcome to week 3 of Pride TT's Pride 2021 events. Right, tonight we have another fabulous event for you all tonight. Right, I'm not gonna give anything too much away, just some general housekeeping, we like to call it. Right, so some general housekeeping. These events are deliberately meant to create visibility and public discussion, which is why we host such events this year and last year, especially on a wider platform, and we will be streaming it live on the social media platforms, right? So tonight's session will be streamed live on Pride TT's social media platform. So make sure you follow Pride TT on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, subscribe to YouTube, and don't forget to download the Pride TT's app in the Google Play Store and coming soon to the Apple Store as well. Another thing is that our sessions are recorded for posterity purposes as well as to document our stories as to what's shared in different events. So that's something we do as well. Additionally, participation of everyone, whether you are on Zoom or you are viewing on Facebook, right? It keeps us encouraged to continue working and to highlight the positive contributions of the LGBTQ plus community in Trinidad and Tobago. Every year, Priorities Management Committee, um, we highlight different issues our community faces. So every year since Pride started taking place 4 years ago, uh, we always had a theme. This year's theme is Power, right? Powher, which focuses on empowering our women and the her history that women have helped develop over the years. Furthermore, we have this year curated over 30 events, right? 30 events, and we are already in week 3. So time flies very quickly. These events are with several community and ally partners. Okay, and we don't want to let anyone feel like they're left out. Additionally, which is why we thank every one of them, the allies, our partners, programming folks, everyone, right? We thank you for all your hard work because Pride is not just about you and me, it's about the entire community as well. Also, don't forget all our additional events for the rest of Pride Month. They're on Pride TT's website at pridett.com, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, social media, the Pride TT's app that was designed by one of our own, Keita. So if you don't know Keita, Keita designed our app, so kudos to Keita. Right, tonight's event, right? Tonight's event, we entitled it the way we did for a purpose, right? So, tonight's event is the stories of queer migrants, inequalities, and their vulnerabilities. We have hosting tonight's event, we have Maria O'Brien. So, a little backstory about Maria is that Maria believes that pride holds the history of struggle and pain in all those who are differently loved and are different. And this is the history what we need to drive us for a better tomorrow. This is Maria's third year in collaborating with Marcus on these Pride workshops. She's also dedicated to bringing to the light the struggles of the LGBT community in Trinidad and Tobago. Her leadership includes past and previously workshops on coming out as queer in the Caribbean, as well as looking into trans voices and experiences within the Caribbean diaspora. Maria also holds a bachelor's in psychology and sociology and has been a member and friend of the community for many years, assisting in numerous projects such as the Silent Art Auction in 2010 in aid of many NGOs and lending aid to Pride TT's Pride Parade. I think that was the first ever Pride Parade. Hobbies. These hobbies are very interesting, actually. Hobbies included playing rugby and later coaching rugby throughout Trinidad and Tobago. Right, so final community announcements, and then we'll get straight into this event. During Pride Month, the Trinidad and Tobago Transgender Coalition 3TC they are hosting a HIV awareness education workshops from Monday to Friday, 5 p.m. Right through from since the beginning of Pride Month throughout until the end of Pride Month this year. All available information. If you want any information regarding that, visit TT Trans Coalition on their social media platforms or check Pride TT's Facebook page. Finally, some very fun news if you haven't heard about it yet. Pride TT this year has collaborated with Scotiabank to expand its generation gap. So if you guys have known in the past years, we have had Gen Gap. So this year, we have partnered with Scotiabank for Gen Gap and to launch a community-run mentorship programs for persons between the ages of 15 to 25. So if you want more information about the partnership with Scotiabank and Gen Gap and how to get part of the mentorship program, please feel free to visit PrideTT's um, website at pridett.com. So without further ado, I am going to hand you all over to tonight's host, Marie O'Brien.
Hey, good night, everyone. Tonight is going to be very interesting, according to my partner in crime. It's going to get intense. He said to bring a pen and pencil and some paper to write shit down. I don't know if you actually want to see this, diaspora the project are committed to dismantling the patriarchal and colonial systems which continue throughout the region. And as to learn and discover the experiences of migrants, we must continue to stand in solidarity with all who have journeyed through these islands. Tonight, what we're looking at is about the migrants, particularly the LGBTQ migrants in Trinidad, and the violence that they continue to experience at the hands of locals. And as we look at that, we want to dedicate this particular project that Marcus and I engaged in to the memory of Mark Anthony Lutchman Singh, also known to many as Maria Venus Raj, who is a beautiful soul who brought light through her drag and dance, as well as his kindness and compassion. He was a talented pageant coach, a young designer who touched so many people with his beauty and his compassion, and was murdered earlier this year. And his memory is what has pushed us to look into this particular idea of violence, particularly against the LGBTQ migrant. The Caribbean Equality Project, who we partnered with tonight. I'm going to give you a little brief history here, if I can keep it short, as Marcus told me to do. It was founded in 2015 by Mohammed Q. Amin in response to anti-LGBTQ hate in Queens, New York. The Caribbean Equality Project is a community-based organization that empowers, advocates for, and represents Black and Brown, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, gender non-conforming, and queer Caribbean immigrants in New York City. Through public education, community organizing, civic engagement, storytelling, and cultural and social programming, the organization work focuses on advocacy for LGBTQ immigrants, for LGBTQ and immigrant rights, gender equity, racial justice, immigration, and mental health services, and ending hate violence in the Caribbean diaspora. To date, the CEP is the only educational-based agency serving the Caribbean American LGBTQ plus community in New York City, with a dedicated aim to cultivating supportive and progressive Caribbean neighborhoods free of violence, oppression, and discrimination. CEP organizing fosters solidarity, community partnership, and greater family acceptance. There's so much more that can be said about CEP, but we're trying to keep things short. So I'm going to move swiftly on to introducing my partner in crime. I've known this guy for more than 10 years. I don't know if to count that as a blessing or not a blessing. It depends on the day. We went to school together, and I can honestly say that I have learned so much from Marcus Kissoon, just from his bravery and everything that he's tried to achieve in the community. And it's been quite an honor to watch him become the amazing person he has become today. He has dedicated his life to fighting for equality and justice for all people in our community, in our country and beyond. It came as no surprise to me when he approached me to help him with this particular topic this year, as Maria's death touched him personally and in such a deep way. He holds an MSc in Interdisciplinary Gender Studies from UWI and has been a member of the women's movement since 2008, focusing on Indianness, masculinity, gender-based violence, child sexual abuse, HIV, and sex work. He is a research and outreach officer for Break the Silence and the Institute for Gender and for the Institute of Gender Studies in UWI. In 2015, Marcus began working with migrants through the Family Planning Association's project on migrant sex workers. And this, I think, is the base of where he's come from for this particular project. So I'm going to hand it over to Marcus, and after he is finished, we'll open it up for some questions so he can help you all to better understand his project. Over to you, Marcus.
Thank you, Maria. Excellent start. I too would like to acknowledge the ancestors before us, my ancestors, those who came through the enslavement of the uh, of the trade system, the slave trade system, and those who came through the Pani Kali um, indentured laborers, and those who may have been queer, living amongst notions of patriarchy, notions of colonial ideas of manhood, womanhood, femininity, and masculinity, those who had to live in secret, those who didn't have language to identify their sexuality and their gender. I acknowledge all of those as I move forward with this presentation. So for those of you, a quick review of what I'm doing is that I will run through a relatively explanation about what I've come to learn about migration, queer migration in the region. It will be a mixture of theory and academics and activism. And what I'm asking you to do is this presentation is to help us think through how we have come to understand queer migration, the experiences, and what we are doing collectively as a response. Um, I will also go into a couple of videos from Caribbean diaspora folks in Global North who've shared their experiences about being migrants in the US as a way to kind of ground the experiences of what I'm about to share. And then we'll open up for questions and answers, guided by Maria, of course. Um, so without any further ado, I will go straight into my presentation. It is definitely a PowerPoint presentation. Just because that's the skill that I hold, and I feel like it helps. It helps a lot with ideas. So I really want to start off by also bringing my regards for Mo Amin, who unfortunately can't be here right now, but really wanted to, but has set the foundation with his organization, Caribbean Equalities Project, to kind of get me in a place where I could do this work comfortably. With myself personally, and then also also do this work collectively with those who are also thinking about the same issue. I think it's also important that I also locate myself. I do this work as a privileged, cisgendered, queer male. I don't speak for the migrant community. I do work for them. What I'm doing is bringing their experiences to this table. I am taking up an issue of a group who's already limited in resources and contributing and raising awareness within my own self and within my own space as part of a collective effort to treat, mitigate, and bring some sort of gender justice to these particular groups. Um, so I will go. So again, my workshop today, and I use the term workshop because I really want us to think through migration, queer migration, the experiences of our LGBT folks as they move. So what is migration? I think it's quite important that we set these little basic understandings. Like I've come to learn migration is often understood to imply a voluntary process, right? Where some people have choice. For example, someone who cross a border in search for better economic opportunities. And we had this conversation with my friends who are also privileged heterosexual males. And I was explaining to them, I said, when you go abroad, you get the title of an expat, but really and truly, you're a migrant, right? You just go across with the benefits of having a job, economic stability, but you're ideally a migrant. And not all experiences are like that, right? So there are even different hierarchies and levels of migration, right? Some people have better opportunities. They're a lot more privileged when they travel abroad, but some don't, right? And this is not the case for refugees, right? We come to, who cannot return home safely and accordingly. our own specific protection under international law. I think this is quite important, that we are coming to understand that migration is a survival method, right? Some do it because they're already in a position of privilege and power and have employment to have to travel and cross borders. And some do it because they don't have that opportunity, right? Migrants or migrant concept, right, takes attention away from specific legal protections refugees require, such as protection from refoulement and from being penalized for crossing borders without authorization in order to seek safety. There's nothing illegal about seeking asylum. That's first and foremost, right? On the contrary, it is a universal right. And I think we have to understand that, right? And there are multiple ways people migrate and cross borders. And one of them is to seek asylum. We do have people in Trinidad seeking asylum from relative countries in the region, from homophobia. We do have political asylum seekers from Venezuela who have been part of anti-government movements in Venezuela who had to move um, because of safety. And refugee and migration are two in its own, but migration really talks about moving. And then as we go further, we'll explain why some people move and the experiences of queer people as they move, right? So I would love to share a little bit about the history of migration. I've come to learn that for centuries, migration has been shaped by the demand of capitalism. And this is rooted in inequalities. We've come to learn capitalism of those who have and those who don't have. And then those who don't have, the processes of acquiring some sort of economic, social stability, right? I think it's also important that we acknowledge this concept called primitive accumulation. This is the seizing of wealth, which was used to launch the industrial products. You know, Marxism in 1957 told us that primitive accumulation cleared the grounds for capitalist agriculture, which made the land part and parcel to capital. So, you know, Europeans had a history of conquering, taking, and land became part of that. And they came to realize that land was so vital in the production of making profit, what we come to understand as the it totally slipped me. What we come to understand as the system that we function in, that allows people to have control over particular products and have the majority of the access and the profit, right? And land, acquiring land, conquering land was the root of how this inequality, this divide, this system to take and not share was all started, right? So after the indigenous genocide, slavery and the enslavement was means to facilitate colonization proper. The colonizers were soon organizing mass forced migration of communities they control. And we come to understand these as, one, the colonizers themselves moving to the lands that they acquire, right? Well, not acquire, that they stole, and then bringing across African slaves and Asian indentured workers, right? Following the abolition of African slavery and enslavement in 1930s, a new migrant stream was now organized, indentured laborers, and these places were people came to the region from India, China, Japan, and Malaya, and they were shipped to the Caribbean to produce labor to fill the capitalist need of colonizers, right? You know, our own local scholars and thinkers have been telling us, Kempadu tells us that migration, both historically and contemporary, is an important part of Caribbean livelihood and strategies and social aspirations, right? The Caribbean is home to one of the most transnationally connected migratory people in the world, right? The Caribbean is home for migrants, and it's also home that exports Caribbean people in the larger global diaspora, Caribbean diaspora in other parts of the world. We all have some family in New York, England, Canada, making their brand, leaving their reputation with our food and culture, dance, music, etc. Contemporary regional migration follows a long history of intergenerational movement of Caribbean people and a history of movement due to political revolutions. We know one of them is the Haitians to other Caribbean countries, mainly for wage labor, right? Um, and most current, because of fragile economy and environmental collapse of Venezuela, or what Maflit calls the crisis of state, we see how we have this contemporary forced migration of Venezuelans moving into parts of the Caribbean region. Uh, Spanish-speaking migrants who reside in Trinidad and Tobago originate from a number of countries. I think that's also important to know that not all Spanish-speaking migrants come from just Venezuela, right? They include Cuba, Dominican Republic, the Panama, to name a few, right? In recent years, per capita Trinidad and Tobago has received more Venezuelan migrants than any other CARICOM territory, right? And this was documented in 2019. It is estimated that TNT hosts about 33,000 plus Venezuelans, and with about 3,000 plus being children. And because my work with children for so long, I have to acknowledge the fact that children are also being brought into this. And it's become so important as we discuss queer lives. You know, it can't just be about queer adults, but I think we have to also understand the queer lives of children, queer migrant children as well, right? And this was documented by UNICEF in 2020. I think it's also important that Latin American migrants aren't the only persons who have come to the region, and especially come to Trinidad and Tobago. Starting from the mid to the late 1970s, Guyana flooded into Trinidad to live and work. And in 2013, we did a stock. Well, I found a stock, migrant stock by origin by the UNICEF, and it said that we also have some Grenadians, about 5,000 plus, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, 5,000 plus, Guyana, 5,000 plus. We have people moving back home who are US and UK citizens, so about 5,000 combined between the US and the UK. And we have a total of about 22,000 plus non-Spanish speaking migrants. So Trinidad has and have always been home to migrants historically and contemporary, and it has a lot to do with our economic stability in comparison to the rest of the region, right? I want us to start thinking about the concept. I wanted to start thinking about the concept, and yes, plantation economy. Thank you so much. What we've come to understand is the plantation economy. Absolutely. How the concept of queer migration. I think we have to start asking ourselves, what are our LGBT plus folks experiencing as they cross borders, and how sexuality shapes the migration processes, right? You know, how concerns about sexual, and I want to ask the question as we think through this, because I don't have the answer, but we as a collective community doing this work can use this as a way to think about the lives of migrants, queer migrants. And I really want to ask the question, how concerns about sexuality shape migration control strategies and constructions of citizenship, and how mass migration in the past quarter century transformed queer communities, cultures, and politics. I think we have to ask ourselves, and these are the, you know, in 2006, these questions were posed already by these two thinkers. And I want to start thinking about these in our region, in our contemporary times. I also want us to be very clear about when we use the term queer, it really normally refers to individuals who fall outside the normative expressions of gender and sexuality. However, while to queer, something involves focusing on the aspects which undermines heteronormative cultural and state processes. So to queer, it means to challenge the existing heteronormative ways that a country, a state, and people have been functioning. And that includes the exclusion of queer voices, queer experiences in all the levels, from the thinking, which is the ideological, to the institutional, the way in which our institutions consider queer experiences, and then the laws and the policies and the constitutions, right? And queer migration creates a productive dialogue between the history of migration and queer history. And I think in order for us to continue doing this work, those who are interested in understanding queer migration, we have to, one, acknowledge the migrant histories and the queer histories within our region. Yeah. Yeah. So let's just talk a little bit about inequalities, how that concept is useful in understanding the links between migrants' experiences to violence, right? So inequalities, queer and feminist and social justice theorists and thinkers tells us that inequalities is the state of not being equal, especially in status, rights, opportunity, power, and respectability. We even nationals, queer nationals, don't even have the same rights and opportunities, safety, and considerations as our heteronormal colleagues, right? In Trinidad and Tobago. Now, when we add the concept of migration to even those existing barriers, it causes, compounded issues in the experiences of migrants, right? The concept of equality implies sameness, homogeneity, and linear measurement, right? But, and that's what Barrett was saying, right? But that becomes even problematic, is that, problematic is that working for gender equality often means, and she explains this through the woman and man relationship, is making women equal to men within a public domain of the state. Ideally, we shouldn't want women to be at the same, women should have to rise to men's and masculine expectations, but women and femininity should have its own value, have its own understanding, and be integrated into everyday society, right? So equality becomes one start, right? Where we want women in non-traditional women spaces, the boardrooms, professions, etc. Those are just numbers, but we also want womanhood. And in the context of queerness, we want queer lives and queer experiences to be given its own acknowledgement and in its own experience and its given right, right? So equality becomes a good start. So I'm asking us as queer people, as we move towards increasing numbers of representation, I do agree, but I want us to consider gender justice, right, as more the end goal, right, where equality is the start. Gender justice, according to Professor Barreto, is a societal condition in which there are no asymmetries of access or allocation of status, power, and material resources in a society, or in control over and capacity to benefit those resources, right? In a gender system characterized by gender justice, there will be no hierarchies of gender identities, right? So the the heterosexual 1% man will not be the desired character to aim for, right? Young Caribbean black and brown bodies wouldn't feel like they have to live up to global north, blonde hair, blue eyes, masculine ideals to fit into society. Black hair, brown hair, black skin, brown skin will all be given equal opportunity, understood, be given the opportunity to understand their inequalities, and be given the opportunity to rise up the social ladder, right? Um, and I think this is quite important as we move forward as a community, that we start thinking gender justice, right? Because let's face it, us as walking able people and persons in wheelchairs, they don't want to walk. They want buildings to be accessible, right? We shouldn't have to be living heterosexual sexual lives with images of masculine and feminine to walk the streets. We should be given the value to dress and perform as we please with our sexuality and gender, and that is what gender justice aims for. Gender inequalities and injustice. Now, I want us to think about these concepts of heteropatriarchy, as Jackie Alexander, a Tobagonian feminist lesbian scholar, she tells us that this is the twin process of heterosexualization and patriarchy. So we know heterosexualization is the hetero man, opposite sex loving kind of relationship, and patriarchy is the governing system where men are viewed at higher value and status than women and some other men, right? And she's asking us to think about these neo-colonial state formation and how it maintains in law and policy. So we continue to see how heteropatriarchy is what governs the way in which colonial laws were created, and how we still try to live in a society that maintains that, right? And social regulation, in some cases, denying erotic autonomy and freedom to move and cross borders. All of this is said to protect the hetero family structure. And now the logic behind this is that colonizers and heteronormative people living in hetero privilege believe that when we step away from heterosexuality, we are challenging the family system, which is not true. We've come to learn that there are multiple ways that family exists, right? Whether it be single mothers, single fathers. And I think we had a recent workshop where there were, I have two moms. We're starting to see these multiple ways in which families exist. And Jackie Alexander reminds us that lesbianism and prostitution are primary sites of moral regulation, especially during colonial era, right? Patriarchal power collapses gender with sex and inscribes male and female bodies with fixed functionalities. We have to also understand that the patriarchy, when we understand gender and sex, we understand gender as a social construct and sex as more as the biology. That patriarchal power wants bodies, whatever you are born with, to maintain particular kinds of expectations and roles based on what we know to understand as masculine and feminine and respectable masculinity and femininity, right? So we're starting to see a sort of a underlining philosophical explanation as to how we have come to challenge, why we come to challenge the Buggery Act, the Immigration Act. We're starting to see the core fundamental ways in which why these thinkings exist, right? And also, Andal Gosain, also Caribbean Indo scholar, tells us to think about heteronationalism, right? This builds on heteropatriarchy, which Jack Alexander talks about, and it adds to the analysis on the experience of race and ethnocentrism, right? We have to acknowledge the fact that race, different bodies, different colors, different people experience these inequalities differently, right? Um, and a good example is hair texture. Black hair is the least valued amongst all hair types, but yet hair is still a kind of a political space. And we know with the history of the banks and hair, etc., right? And and it adds, and sorry, and now I'm asking us as a queer community and people interested in queer migrants to have to consider now migration. Is migration challenging hetero order? what is society saying about migrants and queer migrants now? So now we have to add, we have already talked about our own national experience. Not all bodies are citizens, as Jackie Alexander puts it. But now we have to ask ourselves as a movement, what is society saying about queer migrants? And I'm trying, and this workshop is for us to think through that, right? I want for us to start looking at now some of these actual in place inequalities. Now I've given you a kind of a theory as to why the inequalities exist, but I want us to start looking at some of the inequalities that I found in my research for this particular presentation, right? So one, we have limited healthcare. Now we do have a treat all policy in HIV and in the accident and emergency and pre and postnatal care, right? But we also don't have universal healthcare, and migrants don't have access to chronic diseases, cancer treatments and medicine for chronic diseases such as diabetes, asthma, chronic heart disease, arthritis, glaucoma, mental depression, high blood pressure, um, benign prostatic hyperplasia, enlarged prostate, epilepsy, and the list continues. You could see it, right? Thyroid, etc. And we know that queer people aren't just affected by HIV. However, HIV has taken up a huge responsibility of treating and understanding the queer community, but it is not our only medical issue, right? And more so migrants who come crossing these borders don't come all the time, you know, with they may need medical care sometime. We all do, right? Migrant families with Trinidad, and another here's, and I'm just listing a bunch of different inequalities, right? Migrant families with Trinidad nationals. So people come, they spend years, right? They have children, right? And it becomes difficult to register that child, since parents require something called a cedula de identidad, right? From their embassy, right? Uh, and this is mostly for Venezuelan migrants, right? And this becomes difficult because some are here via illegal border entry, asylum seekers, and or some of them just can't really afford the fees to get this documentation. So imagine, right? You have a child. So as queer people having children, it's already problematic. What about being a migrant queer parent who can't even document your national child for reasons of being here illegally, being an asylum seeker, because you can't report to your state, your country as an asylum seeker, especially Venezuela, or you just can't afford the fees, right? Uh, we also have to consider some inequalities with our Immigration Act, specifically Section 6, um, that uh, that prohibits persons from entering our country on the earnings of prostitution or homosexuals, or persons reasonably suspected of coming to Trinidad and Tobago for these or any other immoral purposes. And we start to see how who gets to dictate what is morality in our laws. Are we considering queer identities when building these laws? And we know that, colonial era, no one, it was one way of moral thinking, right? And we've come to learn that same-sex loving isn't immoral. Section 9 tells us that we're so required by the regulations as a person seeking admission to Trinidad and Tobago, or a person referred to in Section 8 shall undergo a mental or physical examination, or both by a medical officer. Now, I asked, my fellow immigration persons and my advocates in the room, what are the protocols for trauma reduction for gender non-conforming and transgender migrants when they come through the borders and may be subjected to a physical exam, right? I think these are important questions to ask ourselves. I don't have the response, but at least we are thinking about these things when we are thinking about queer migrants. Section 22, where he has not acknowledged, therefore any public officer shall send a written report to the minister in respect of paragraph A, blah, 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 to the chief immigration officer in respect of paragraph, blah, 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 with full particulars concerning reporting. So this now becomes so important to reporting violence, because remember, we're trying to understand how migrant people experience violence, their vulnerabilities to violence in Trinidad and Tobago. So reporting violence to the police, migrants are afraid of risk of being detained because of this particular act. Any person other than a citizen of Trinidad and Tobago who enter before or after the commencement of this act came to Trinidad and Tobago at any place other than a port of entry, which we do know people don't come through the relevant legal ports, has eluded examination inquiry under this act. Every person who is found upon inquiry duly held by a special inquiry officer to be person described in section 1 is subjected to deportation. So the reason why migrants may not report to police is because of this particular act. They are afraid of acknowledging themselves to the relevant authorities because the police has a legal right to report to immigration their either overstay or their illegal entry, or not having the right documentation. So we see how, so we as queer people know how difficult it is to one, report, because we don't have laws to protect us in the kinds of ways queer people experience violence. And now migrants have these multiple layers of barriers for reporting to police. I think it's also important that we understand how people are misunderstanding or the misunderstood social, cultural, and economic perceptions of migrants. I went to this conference 2019, and this is what was said. And this is from the newspapers, the reporter picked it up. While the concerns about sexual exploitation was raised by a member of the audience, a Venezuelan woman working bars, head of the San Fernando Business Association, this woman, chose that line of work, right? Venezuelans are not here to help TNT. Let's get that straight. They are here to send stuff back home. The females love to work in bars. We know why. They get tips and the opportunity opportunity for them to get more money with whatever else they do in these bars. I think it's the ladies that gravitate to the bars, they want that job. I think it's quite important that people have to understand the social push and pull factors that put migrant women and migrant LGBT folks into particular lines of work, right? And we do know what those barriers are. Language, not being respected, all of these things continue to contribute to why women and LGBT folks are put into particular kinds of jobs, including using their bodies as a means of survival, right? And we get to that later. Vulnerabilities, right? I think it's important that we understand this concept of vulnerabilities. How do migrants, after seeing all of this injustice, inequalities to access a service, etc., how does this make them vulnerable now, right? So unequal gender relations and power dynamics between male and female are the root cause of gender-based violence. We know that. When men and masculines, they feel that they have to exert their power by taking control over women and men who are perceived as less powerful, right? The expectations of or beliefs about girls and boys' bodies and sexualities, gender relations have implications for vulnerabilities to violence. This includes child sexual abuse, which is what I'm working on as well, childhood incest, economic dependencies, silencing, bodily harm, public shame, fear, lack of access to help and support. And all of these we could name, and we've observed, public shaming of migrants on social media and in the public, migrants remaining silent because of the fact that they don't think that their bodies have right to protection, safety, freedom, right? We know how women, migrant bodies, and trans bodies have constantly been violated, exoticized, etc., right? Um, I think it's important for us to also understand that the beliefs about masculinity and machismo, right, hypermasculinity, hegemonic masculinity, which provides males with an informal sense of rights to assert power and sexual authority over females and perceived weaker men, right? And we do know how the queer community can be perceived as weaker men, right? And people take advantage of that, and adding the fact that you're a migrant, undocumented. We know how that could contribute to your own personal safety or having to negotiate your body to maintain work. And you'll see that later on in a case study, right? In a culture that emphasizes male superiority and control, male subordination, powerlessness are considered unacceptable. So some queer men who may have failed in protecting themselves, their families, may remain silent, right? May not access the kind of help and services that they need because it challenges their manhood, right? And I think it's also important because this is so relevant to young queer um, men and boys in the community, right? Early labor force entry that to have some kind of economic stability, yes. And in cases of the need to find an older partner who provides them with financial support and shelter becomes critical to their survival within the host country. So, we have to think, are these migrant men, women, queers coming to steal our men, coming to steal our women, or are they forced into using their bodies as a means of survival? I think these are important questions. I want to go through a case study for this presentation. I interviewed a couple of migrants, and they gave me some of their feedback about the inequalities and their experiences with violence. And one of them said that, and I find it was okay, but by then again it was unbearable because we had to work every day. It was literally from 8 o'clock until 7 o'clock every day from Monday to Sunday, right? um, they go on to explain, the queer migrant goes on to explain that this is the employer, normally used to extend my passport. So he asked me to give him my passport. So I literally gave him my passport. When I gave him my passport, he gets it done. But then he took my passport and gave it to his wife. And that's not all, because I was made to understand that a lot of people who goes there to work, he would take the passport, and when time to give them back, he don't want to give them back. It was fine. So the fact is, I worked, but then I had wanted my passport, I didn't get it. She had the passport, so it becomes unbearable. So I had to get away. So we see how queer migrants, taking away their ability to move, any form of documentation becomes weaponized by employers to hold them ransom to do work that has been institutionally, constitutionally deemed unfit for any human life, right? Working from Monday to Sunday, right? Almost 12 hours, right? Um, I also want us to acknowledge the fact that there are multiple reports in the news about violence experienced by queer persons, some that the media has either misgendered, misrepresented. Some we know from the community, some who were open. For example, the 2017 murder of the Guyanese man. Then there was Mark Anthony Singh, also known as Maria Venus Raj, who was killed earlier this year. And then there was the incident about the 20-year-old who met someone, and we all know the underground ways of meeting people because homosexual courting and engaging has to be underground. It is not socially acceptable to go to a bar and have a conversation with someone. So we have to do it underground. And as a result of this 20-year-old was stabbed 13 times, right? So we do have documented some cases of queer persons experiencing violence, and these were all migrants, as I've come to understand in my own research. Continuing with the case study, another queer migrant was saying, I get pushed down, my phone get took away. 2 times my chain gets snatched from me. People will insult me on the way to work, call me all sorts of names like faggot and bullaman and these insultive things. But as time goes by, all I think about is just a day pay and just get to work and do what I have to do and leave. There are many times where I have been threatened about do not walk back on that street, because if you walk back on that street, they will beat me or they will kill me and stuff like that. So queers and queer migrants also ridicule to the kinds of homophobia that we experience in a homophobic society, not to mention things like sexism that women migrants, LGBT women migrants have faced as well. By no means is that to trivialize that experience at all as well. So when I went to the police, and this is this queer migrant sharing an opportunity that when they decided to go to the police, I went to the police station and I explained to the police, and them knew what I was too. Okay, we're going to look into the matter. That was the response of the police. That was it. My face was scratched, my knees was bruised. We're hearing the level of violence, that kind of physical violence, right? And they will take care of it, and like they were making mockery. This is a queer migrant talking about how they felt in the police station, making a mockery out of me while I was making the statement. They were making a mockery out of me, so I felt so ashamed. No one should ever have to feel shame or humiliated in a space of protection, right? They were making a mockery out of me, so I felt so ashamed. No one should ever have to feel shame or humiliated in a space of protection, Hi, Maria. I think I got cut off. What was the last thing you all heard?
You were
Making
talking
a
Sorry?
mockery
about
out of you, making a mockery out of me. I think that was the last thing I heard.
Right. So they were, they were making, and it's so sad that on already this enfranchised population has to walk away from a service that protects, feeling that they would not get any satisfaction or justice, right? Whew. Should I make this presentation a little shorter? um, you know, and they go on to tell us about multiple ways in which they experience inequalities and vulnerabilities. This is a queer migrant telling me that they were expected, like generally the people that they were around and was living and dwelling around, either with sharing or cohabitation, renting, roommates, etc. They were expecting more from me to give them, okay, fine. Like if I work for 500, they expected more than what I work for. Yes, that was a point in time. Sorry. So what this person was telling us is that they knew that they were undocumented. They knew that they didn't have the opportunity to access service or rights or to report. And they were being basically bullied into giving money in an unjust system of sharing rent, right? Yes, there was a point in time when the individual actually take my stuff and just throw it out of the apartment. So imagine a queer migrant who already is dissatisfied with the protective service is now being violated, experience violence in the safety of their home, where they're trying to, contribute, pay their rent, etc. But people want more. and they're being tossed out. And we do know that we have land rights and tenants responsibilities, right? Okay, queer communities resort to sex work as a way of survival because of limited access to work opportunities. The Trans Coalition has told us numerous occasions how queer people, because they don't have access to work and jobs and qualification and schools and all of these inequalities, puts them at risk for doing sex work. Sorry, all the risk that comes with doing sex work, where their bodies become the only way of surviving, right? So the resort to sex work, it's not like you didn't try to get a job. Sometimes if you do happen to go with, and this is someone now who's saying that they couldn't get a job because of their migrant status, their queer status, and they have to resort to sex work. Sometimes if you do happen to go with someone, they say they will give you a certain amount of money, and after finish, they don't want to give you, they give you next to nothing, and all of these inequalities, disadvantages, and violations. I think this is also another one who works, another queer employed migrant says that you want to talk for your rights. Like, I need to take a vacation. You cannot talk about it because if you talk about it, you will get deported. And this is what criminologists and social psychologists calls the fear of deportation. And which inhibits the process of integration, lack of development and social capital, trust and network ties, becoming a barrier to safer, more social cohesive communities. When people are afraid of being deported, it leads to all of these, right? Even talking, and that comes from being fearful of talking. This, one migrant said that they don't get vacation time. The legal amount of sick leave and vacation time this is not a privilege for nationals. This is a human right to have the opportunity to take time off from your place of work when you are sick, when you need it, right? And it is not given to everyone. I think this is also important for us to acknowledge. I want, as I speak to my queer community, those who are doing this work, I want us to think about these things, right? I want us to think about the intersectional approach that looks at race and gender in addition to sexuality when studying migration. We have to consider all of these things. I also want us to think about particular challenges of subgroups within this pool that are even more vulnerable, such as queer migrants of color or transgender migrants. I also want us, and I know Brandy does a lot of work around that, I want us to also interrupt the latest wave of xenophobia and fear through ensuring that the histories and concerns of queer migrants are not forgotten in the process. So we have this almost heteronormative way of thinking about migrants, and we have to center the conversation around that is happening about xenophobia around queer migrants and their experiences with xenophobia, right? I also want us as a community to hold the state responsible for the treaties, the international treaties that they are signatory to, and all of these speak to migrant rights and ways of working with migrants, right? The convention related to the status of refugee, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, the ILO Migration for Employment Convention, the UN Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime, and so forth. So we have to be able to know what our country has said that they will do and hold them responsible and accountable to it, right? And that brings me to the end of my presentation. What I will do now is the Caribbean Equalities Project has documented a couple of interviews with Caribbean diaspora in Global North. And I think a good way for us to ground what we have learned today is by listening to the stories of these Caribbean Equalities Project members and how being a migrant in Global North and their experiences. And I will hand you back over to Maria. So we will go straight into the videos, right? And then we'll go straight to, so have your questions. Um, okay, so I will start here. Let me just make sure that the let me just make sure that
So we're starting the videos now, Marcus.
yeah.
Okay. If anyone has any questions, just send them to me and I will use them to guide our question and answer section.
All right, I think it's my internet. Just give me a second to. Sorry about that. Let me try again. Wait. Yeah, Maria, I'm back. You hearing me?
I'm hearing you, but we're still not seeing the presentation.
Okay, let me try one more time. If not, we just go straight to the
I am Theo Brown, the Public Relations Officer for Caribbean Equality Project based here in New York City. My journey to accepting
Yeah, Maria, I think my internet feed is really bad.
everything about me, everything that I am as a queer Jamaican.
So I would recommend we go straight to the question and answer, if that's okay with you, Madam Chair. Yeah, I will just do quick question and answer now.
Yeah, that sounds good since we can't seem to get anything going with those videos. So far I've only have one question from Akash Samaru. He's asking, how can the people in the media help?
I think that's an excellent question. Well, firstly, I think anyone who's interested in doing this work has to check their privilege at the door, right? Your heteronormative privilege, your privilege to disseminate information is what the media is known for. And I think, how do we start to see queers experience in everything that we report on? So if we're reporting on migrants, how are these disenfranchised groups, these underprivileged, invisibilized groups, how are they being considered in the process of reporting? Because what happens is we report in this very heteronormative way, right? And I think it's quite important that we do center queer identities and ask queer persons their feedback on the issue. I think it's quite important that media should have a powerhouse of consultants to talk about issues, even if it's not a direct specific issue. You know, we have to start thinking about queers in politics. We have to start queering all the laws. You know, we've started doing the Domestic Violence Act. We've started to queer the Domestic Violence Act and their response. You know, we have to queer the police training. We have to queer the health system, right? So I think those are the places where we have to start about how do we ask the question, how does this affect the queer community?
Okay. Anyone else have any other questions? I haven't really gotten any so far. How can the community, the local community, help the migrants with their disenfranchisement? Because we're all LGBT, but there is a clear gap between migrant LGBT and citizen LGBT.
Absolutely. I think the community is known for looking at the intersectionalities of how people experience violence, inequalities, and vulnerabilities. this platform, this presentation today is an excellent opportunity for us to see how we come together as a collective to talk about those who may not have the opportunity to talk about or create opportunities for those who may not have the opportunity to talk about their own experiences with violence and inequalities. I think the queer community needs to follow the same basic principles as all persons interested. We center those who are disenfranchised into the conversation. So we are a queer community, yes. We have to center now queer migrants' experiences. We have to, and we saw that in the movement of Trinidad Pride, the hard work of the Trinidad and Tobago Trans Coalition. They started to center trans queer experiences in the larger queer pride movement, right? Because they could have easily have been either a token in the queer community, they could have been either forgotten and stepped aside. We have to center all, and this is my calling, was for us to start thinking about who are disenfranchised, even our subgroup, right? I had asked for us to start thinking about migrant queer Black bodies, what are the Haitians who are coming across because of for political and other state instabilities? What are their experiences coming here like? I think we have to acknowledge, and we have to start doing the work and asking ourselves who are being affected in not the mainstream kind of, gay men issues, kind of patriarchal, masculine ways of just men's issues, right? The lesbian community has been pushing for their experiences to be considered in the larger queer community, right? So I think that is quite important. Yeah.
Okay. Do you think that the fact that Trinidad has worked so hard to have a very visible and open pride and community as a whole created Trinidad as a place where LGBT migrants want to come?
Yeah, you can repeat that last part. I kind of broke up.
I was asking if you think that because of the visibility of our pride in our community, that Trinidad has become a place where LGBT migrants want to come to.
Yeah, we have seen that kind of queer tourism existing, where once something becomes visible, it automatically gives some kind of reassurance that it's either safe or acceptable, or that there's just a collective of people who says, to hell with it, come and celebrate with us, which Trinidad has had for years. Underground, of course, people would come to queer gatherings during carnival. So we had our own subcategory of queer carnival existing. That has always been part of what I call the queer Caribbean civilization. People have moved within islands to celebrate with each other, right? I have been to Suriname Pride, right? I think Luke was also there with me in 2016. So I do think that visibility could contribute to the queer tourism and the visibility and the push forward needed, right? We also have to acknowledge what does this visibility look like in Maria and who is being visible. In the earlier days, tourism was about white bodies being on Caribbean sands, right? Now that we are now including different kinds of imagery, we have to understand that there are Indian identities in the Caribbean that makes up Indo-Caribbean queer, experiences. They're Asian. There are other kinds of Asians, right? There are other kinds of influences that exist. That we have to think about who are we celebrating, who becomes the visibility of the Caribbean, and just really diversify. So yeah.
Okay. And how do you think that the LGBT community can push the governing bodies as a whole to make Trinidad safer, not just for our own LGBT people, but for the migrants that come here seeking asylum?
Yeah, it goes back to that point in my presentation where I said we have to know what our government is internationally agreeing to. There is a list of international treaties that talks about how we treat migrants, people moving cross borders in the region. We have to use those documents to hold state accountable to what they said that they would do. You know, we have been doing it in the women's movement with CEDAW and somewhat with the rights of the conventional rights of the child. We have to now look at what are our queer and migrant international policies and guidelines, um, and start calling our government out on it and saying, listen, you said that you were going to do this, and we need to start mobilizing the same ways that the feminist and women's movement has mobilized and report back as an individual body. We have to collectively come and say that you are signatories to ending violence, etc., or all forms of violence against humanity, etc. But yet the Domestic Violence Act doesn't account for same-sex relations, intimate partner violence. We have to use these international treaties. We have to report to these international bodies collectively when we document and we put it and we send it off. These international bodies normally, you know, write back or make a phone call to the state and say, hey, this collective group is saying that you're not considering this. We are putting forward this recommendation and we're giving you a few years to respond to it. And I think it's a very useful, I think it's a very useful tool to hold state accountable, right? In addition to the kinds of work that the queer community has been doing, going in front of parliament, wearing the colors, ensuring that corporate TNT is saying the right things on social media. You know, I think this is just another way of adding to the what Sadi Baksh calls co-motion, the collective movement of people to do something.
Okay, I just got a question from Asha, Alec. She's asking, how do we start the trek to gender justice? Not just equality, but more so making the strides to changing archaic laws and authorities which still govern and exist today.
Yeah, so so I'm glad gender equality is the start, gender justice, and again, it goes right back down to my same explanation to anyone who all that I've been giving is a pathway to gender justice. When we consider the multiple ways society experiences inequalities and injustice, when we understand how people who function and are able differently, wheelchairs, being blind, deaf, when we consider those people and our policies and systems are automatically considering them. So for example, I may have failed as a gender justice advocate because and this is for multiple reasons, but I should have had a person who was doing sign interpretation and somebody who was doing Spanish interpretation for this workshop, right? So I think when we consider all of those communities that don't have the same access to schools, schools shouldn't be built in a very able way, right? Which is staircase, front door, window, chair, and desk, right? When we consider the fact that rural women in far places in the country that taxi services end at 6 o'clock. When we consider that for education and we provide transport, we've started to work towards a gender justice system, an equitable way of ensuring everyone gets what they need to reach to this kind of functionality, acceptability, the social pie that we all want, right? And I will tell Asha that one of the hardest things to get to that is the ideological. People have to start thinking away from power, masculine and patriarchal power and privilege. We have to start thinking away from this one-sided idea of what a family is, because again, anybody who challenges the family system isn't respected in law, culture, society, right? So we have to start seeing that all ways of life, right, all ways of queer life can and needs to be considered in specific particular ways in order to have gender justice.
Okay, she sent another question. She's asking, what can be done for migrants who are brave enough to report their abuse to the police and receive no traction?
Yeah, I think that is excellent. I think what I've seen, and this is just experience, but some of the queer communities in Trinidad have started documenting the experiences. So they document the experiences, they highlight and they try to understand the systematic shortcomings of this of how migrants experience um, inequalities, vulnerabilities, and then they now write their own policy, their own take on what needs to be considered, and then they distribute it to parliamentarians, policymakers, corporate TNT, anyone who has any kind of power in social development, right? They start presenting them with their own take on what the policy should look like to consider those persons who weren't considered.
I'm seeing here
So it's really a bottom-up kind of approach.
I'm seeing here that Faye has indicated that since 2011, the government was told to provide protections for the LGBT community and for migrants. Has this been done?
Yeah, Faye, I can't respond because I don't know, honestly don't know the system. I think if anybody else in the chat or in the group could respond, that would be important. But yeah, I don't know what is the government's take because I can't speak on the government's position. So yeah, I don't know if anybody else in the group, any of the other groups, Friends for Life, I see Family Planning, any other of the groups. I don't know if Rudy may have a response to that.
Well, Faye has also indicated that this year Trinidad is going to be reviewed.
Yeah, we're under the Universal Periodic Review, and I think this is an excellent opportunity for us as queer people, queer individuals, queer groups to put together a shadow report, a report of our own individual experiences as CSOs, as non-governmental, and present it to the Universal Periodic Review Board or committee.
Well, Marcus, we're late on that already. The deadline was at the end of March. And these are things that we need to be very, very concerned about.
Of course.
Yeah. So they actually had the reports were due in the end of March. But the UPR body is inviting and has had workshops this year, and there's another one coming up very soon about how we treat that body. So the more that we get involved in it and get more skilled and knowledgeable about it, we can use these systems to try to put some pressure upon the government to bring about the changes that are necessary for equality, for protections, and so forth. But we all have to, one, know about it, know how it works, to get on the inside of it.
That's an excellent point, Faye. Yeah.
Any more questions?
Well, if nobody, any questions, Maria?
No, I'm not seeing any more questions. So I suppose we can close off for the night. I want to say thank you to the Caribbean Equality Project for their support and information. I want to say thank you to Rudy for giving us this opportunity through Pride TT to have this discussion and to bring this information to light. I want to say thank you to everyone that came and sat with us and learned with us as we went through this experience. And I also want to say a very, very big thank you to Marcus for doing all of his work and putting together his presentation. Thank you everyone for attending and have a happy Pride.
Thank you. Good night, everybody.
Does Rudy want
Night.
anything, Maria? Does Rudy
Love,
want
Marcus.
What's that, Marcus?
does Rudy want to say anything? Is he still on the chat?
I'm not sure. He is still on the chat. Rudy, do you have any? Would you like to add anything before we close off?
I would only add that these conversations obviously are critical in advancing our cause. I think sometimes we have them not often enough and publicly enough. And I think that that's one of the reasons we're always happy to provide the platform at Pride TT. We are planning to have programming after Pride this year, all through the year. So going into our 5th anniversary, and we welcome all of you all. Like, if you all have any event or any discussion that you want to have, reach out to us and we'll promote it for you and make sure we get eyes and ears on the discussion. So Marcus, if you want to have a monthly, I say weekly, but anything any of you all want to do, reach out and let us continue to platform the discussion. Because if you look at some of our social media reach, after tonight, this live is going to reach hundreds of people and sometimes thousands of people afterwards. So that's what we're here for, and we're really happy that tonight went off as it was planned, and we're committed to this work.
Thank you, Rudy. And you never know, Marcus and I will brainstorm and see if we're up for that.
Yeah, come true, come true.
Okay, so well, everyone have a good night. Stay safe and COVID free. And happy Pride.
Right.
Thank you. Have a good night, everybody.
Night.
Good night.